Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, we've got an investigation into Labour Together and what looks like a smear campaign run against journalists. It's been treated as a new investigation, but as we'll discuss, it was actually broken by an independent newspaper quite a few months ago. We'll be looking at Yvette Cooper, former Home Secretary's reaction to last week's historic ruling that found her prescription of Palestine Action unlawful. And Francesca Albanese seems to be the subject of a disinformation campaign, and many countries are falling for it. I'm Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Kieran Andrieu. Kieran, nice to see you. How are you?
I am very well, Stephen. And given that many have said that we resemble one another, I am happy to reveal to the audience that you and I are doing our own genealogical tests to see whether, in fact, I am your Palestinian half-brother from another mother.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were both a little surprised by the revelation
Pleasantly
that
surprised.
We are indistinguishable, but I can tell you how to tell us apart. I am the one with the glow-in-the-dark February skin, and Kieran has the lovely Mediterranean glow. That's the way.
Too kind. I don't agree, but thank you.
Right. Before we get into our first story tonight, in the past few weeks, we've seen just how quickly the news cycle can change. And it often feels challenging, even for us, to keep up to date with all of the content being made. But newsletters are a reliable way for us to keep you up to date on all of our news. So if you'd like a selection of Novara's best articles delivered to your inbox every Wednesday, sign up to our newsletter, The Pick. Head to novara.media/The Pick to get it this week. And we also just want to take a moment to thank all of our supporters who have made all of Novara's reporting on Palestine Action possible at all, and all of our reporting in general. Labour Together, the think tank that took Keir Starmer to power, has long been known to have indulged in some pretty shady practices in its effort to elevate Keir Starmer to Prime Minister. But a fresh scandal looks set to engulf the government, and it appears to implicate current Cabinet Minister Josh Simons, or so it's alleged. In 2023, while Chief Executive of Labour Together, Simons is alleged to have authorised US PR firm APCO to run a smear campaign on journalists digging into the group's funding at a cost of £36,000. Now, APCO was hired just days after this investigation appeared in the Sunday Times in 2023, written by Times political and deputy political editors Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York. It revealed that Morgan McSweeney, Starmer's former chief of staff, but previously also the head of Labour Together, had failed to declare £730,000 worth of donations between 2017 and 2020. Now, you may remember that's exactly the period that Labour Together was plotting the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn and manoeuvring to make Starmer the leader of the opposition instead. The Electoral Commission would later find the group guilty of 20 breaches of campaign finance laws, issuing a fine in 2021. Now, you'd be forgiven, given what comes next, for thinking that Labour Together never quite got over being found out on their financial practices. The Sunday Times reports that when Josh Simons commissioned APCO in 2023, Morgan McSweeney, the man who Simons replaced as Labour Together leader, knew about the decision. The Sunday Times has now seen a copy of the 58-page report that APCO delivered to Simons, written by former Sunday Times employee Tom Harper. Delivered to Labour Together in 2024 and codenamed Operation Cannon, the Times says this about its contents. Harper wrote that he had examined the sourcing, funding and origins of the Sunday Times story using documents and discrete human source inquiries. He then sought to portray Pogrund and York as part of a Russian campaign to damage Starmer. He alleged without evidence that the emails which underpinned the published story were likely to have emerged from a suspected Kremlin hack of the Electoral Commission. The likeliest culprit is the Russian state, or proxies of the Russian state, he wrote. There is no evidence that Harper considered an alternative scenario or at any point sought basic IT or cybersecurity expertise. APCO is not a cybersecurity company. APCO's report included baseless claims about Pogrund's faith, upbringing, and personal and professional relationships. It referenced the journalist's status as a Jew, quoting a supposed Sunday Times source who alleged there was an odd mismatch between Pogrund's faith and what they falsely described as his political and ideological position. The report said Pogrund's reporting on other matters, including the royal family, could be seen as destabilising to the UK and also in the interest of Russia's strategic foreign policy objectives. Harper also falsely claimed that previous stories had come from pro-Russian actors. Now, is that unbelievable how serious those kinds of claims would be and how damaging they could be to a journalist's reputation, that their personal political biases were somehow influencing their reporting, that those personal political biases that he was alleged to have ran contrary in a strange way to his faith, and that Russia was sort of behind all of it without any evidence. So, it's that presentation of a kind of story without any evidence that really lends credence to the idea that what APCO was doing was creating a smear campaign. But that wasn't the end of it. A version of that report was then handed on to GCHQ. This is from the Times again. A shorter version of the report, stripped of the personal claims about Pogrom, but with a section on the Sunday Times article, was shared with the National Cybersecurity Centre, part of GCHQ, which declined to launch a full investigation. Labour Together, however, used the fact of the GCHQ referral to create suspicion about the story and its sources, with cabinet ministers and special advisers among those who quietly alleged the report was linked to the Russian state. So a very effective smear campaign there. You've got the Labour Together or somebody handing it to GCHQ, GCHQ saying we won't investigate, but the fact that they've got it is being used and being picked up by various ministers, various politicians, and used as a way of smearing journalists or discrediting journalists. Now, in response to the report, Josh Simons has said this. I was surprised and shocked to read the report extended beyond the contract by including unnecessary information on Gabriel Pogrund. I asked for this information to be removed before passing the report to GCHQ. No other British journalists were investigated in any document I or Labour Together ever received. Now, Gabriel Pogrund hasn't responded directly to the contents of the Times investigation, although he was advertising it on Twitter before it came out. But his colleague, Harry York, posted this. Gabriel Pogrund and I were the subject of a disgraceful smear campaign just for doing our jobs. I'm proud that the Sunday Times is calling it out on the front page tomorrow. So this was on Saturday night. Labour activists paid for smear campaign against journalists. And it goes on. Also want to add that while I mentioned in the report Gabriel Pogrund is inexplicably the main target, he is by far the nicest, objective and most talented journalist I know, which makes this sordid tale even worse. Now, the Sunday Times story has also caused some pretty big political shockwaves. Keir Starmer, who has today said he knew nothing about Labour Together's commissioning of the reporting into journalists, has ordered an investigation into the Labour Together claims. Today, a spokesperson said the Prime Minister has complete confidence in Josh Simons, which is, frankly, given the last few weeks, always a bit of a kiss of death. But for many, the investigation is too little too late. This was Labour MP John McDonnell on the Today programme.
I wrote to the General Secretary of the Labour Party and said that I think this warrants an investigation because if any of this is accurate, it's really shocking. The reply, and I tried to get the Labour Party to be ahead of the game because I thought at least what the Labour Party could do, acknowledge there might be a problem here and then announce that there's going to be an independent investigation, and that would have at least been able to get somewhere near the truth. I got a reply from the General Secretary that said this isn't a Labour organisation, even though I said, look, it's managed and controlled by Labour Party members, quite senior Labour Party members. And I was referred to the complaints department about individual members of the party. And I said, that doesn't meet the seriousness of this case.
Just spell that out, would you, John? Because you raised Russia, you raised Iran. For people who may think this is all complicated, murky goings on in Westminster, are you saying that we are seeing or have seen the sort of behaviour that you would expect to see from an undemocratic regime in its attitude to journalists?
That's the allegation being levelled against Labour Together. And so you know what it's like as a journalist. If someone damages your reputation, it could be career-ending, couldn't it? You could have your reputation damaged, and actually it damages your potential as a future journalist. And so I thought this is serious allegations. The Labour Party should get on top of it at the earliest stage. And I've written 4 times now to the General Secretary of the Labour Party, including to Keir Starmer, to say this is serious, launch an investigation. But that's not happened.
McDonnell's points were put to Science Minister Liz Kendall, also on the Today programme.
We had John McDonnell, Labour MP, on the programme earlier. He says he's written 4 times to Labour's General Secretary and to the Prime Minister asking for an investigation to be launched. Is that something you back?
Well, the Cabinet Office will be looking at the facts around what's happened here.
Is that an investigation?
I would just say this, that the freedom of the press is absolutely essential for me personally, but for the government as a whole. And the journalists that were looked into here, they are journalists of great experience and great integrity, and they make our lives difficult sometimes, and rightly so. We should be held to account. So I think it's absolutely right that the relevant regulatory body that covers public affairs is already investigating this. The Cabinet Office will be establishing the facts around it.
Is that the same as launching an investigation, which is what John McDonnell says he's been rebuffed on 4
establishing
times?
the facts is the first thing that you've got to do on anything, isn't it? If you want to look into something properly, you have to be able to establish the facts.
So what do we have there? We have the Cabinet Office investigating an organisation run by, wait for it, someone who is now a Cabinet Office Minister, John Simons. And then we have Liz Kendall, whose failed 2015 leadership campaign was orchestrated by Morgan McSweeney, also a former leader of Labour Together, promoting that apparently circular inquiry as perfectly legitimate. Kieran, another week, another Labour scandal, it looks like. This seems particularly, I mean, it's not Labour, it's Labour Together. The Labour Party denies that Labour Together is part of the Labour Party, as John McDonnell said. But pretty close to the heart of government. Morgan McSweeney was in Downing Street. Keir Starmer is in Downing Street because of Morgan McSweeney, Josh Simons in the Cabinet Office. All looks a bit sordid, doesn't it?
You know, it's bad when I can say hand on heart that none of this shocks me or surprises me. It's very ugly stuff. It's very ugly stuff indeed. Gabriel Pogren's a very brilliant journalist, even though we come from different political traditions. But the kind of stuff that's surfacing is extremely ugly. None of it shocks or surprises me. These people are career politicians. They're career political strategists. That doesn't mean that every single career politician behaves that way, or every strategist for that matter. But these guys, I mean, with every piece of information that emerges, Stephen, day on day, it is increasingly obvious to me that Keir Starmer is the modern world's Faust for German legend. Went out into the street in the middle of the night in Camden sometime in the past, went to the zebra crossing, exchanged his soul with the devil in exchange for power. And you know, he is the know-nothing Prime Minister, the outsource everything Prime Minister. There's always been venality and corruption in politics, always. But usually there is also a vision and actual political output that benefits some people in society, or there is a sense of ownership by the Prime Minister or the leader of that party presiding over the corruption. In this case, we've got just a total outsourcing of all responsibility for everything. And you're right, it's a circular process of self-assessment with the so-called investigation. It's people marking their own homework. You know, and these guys, to go back to what I was saying about them being strategists and career politicians, though I stress that not all of them are like that necessarily, they're either egotistical nihilists. The best of them are egotistical nihilists, means they believe in nothing but their own ego and their own advancement. The worst of them are, in my view, utilitarian. What do I mean by utilitarian? They think that they can justify anything in the present on the basis that the greater good will be accomplished in the end. So they can say, well, let's bribe these people, or let's screw these people over, let's smear these people. Because in the long run, all we need to do is get the Tories out of power. And once we do what? Because as I say, it's not, that venality is not coupled in Starmer's case with any kind of vision, any kind of benefit in the long run.
I think one of the things that I find so striking about, the last few weeks in particular has brought it into special focus, but the kind of trajectory of Keir Starmer as a leader. You know, if you think back to 2024 and the kind of centrist Labour right, sort of liberal joy at the idea of Keir Starmer as this sort of upstanding, moral, former prosecutor, human rights lawyer, who was going to sort of fill the vacuum of good governance left by the Tories and sort of take us into, a fresh period in which we're under the rule of somebody who runs things on solid moral principles.
Yeah.
And that is all completely evaporated. I mean, it evaporated really early on just on the basis of political choices made by the cabinet. But at this point, there is, now that that's gone, there is nothing left of Keir Starmer, right? There was the facade, there was the mythology, there was a kind of liberal celebration of something actually politically often fairly meaningless. And now there's nothing except for a man who, according to one profile I read recently, thinks it's his job to say yes or no, and he mostly says yes.
No, you're completely right. And people like Otto English, that famous and now frequently lampooned tweet, in which the day after the election he said, "It's nice, isn't it, the silence." People like Piers Morgan, who said, "We now have somebody who looks like Prime Minister." That's such an important thing. We have a man who looks the part. You just think, I mean, are these people really that vacuous? It's so based on vibes or aesthetics and so little of substance. And, final thought on that, we on the left were right about Keir Starmer, not because we're geniuses necessarily, but because we looked very closely at what he'd actually done in his journey to becoming Labour leader. And that was that breakneck pivot was definitely a blueprint for what was to come. And I think that's why we were ahead of the curve on it. The kind of yapping mainstream media personalities like the two I've mentioned were, as I say, just had nothing to fall back on but the sensibilities that they develop at their dinner parties, the vibes, the idea of someone as a leader, and so on.
The Sunday Times investigation has created a potentially dangerous political storm, but it's not exactly new. Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York weren't the only journalists to have worked on the 2023 expose of Labour Together's finances. Also contributing was Paul Holden. Last November, he published his book, The Fraud, Keir Starmer, Morgan McSweeney and the Crisis of British Democracy, a pretty riveting and relentless investigation into the inner workings of Labour Together. But in 2023, he contributed to that original Sunday Times investigation into Labour Together finances, where he was said to have made Electoral Commission documents available to the Times journalists. Now, that put him in the crosshairs alongside Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York. And Scottish paper The National broke this story in September last year, reporting on how Labour Together hired investigators to look into Holden. Written by Richard Sanders and Peter Oborne, the investigation exposes two reports written by APCO. The first was focused on Holden and seemed clearly aimed at discrediting his work, with The National reporting this. It pointed out Holden received funding for work on corruption in South Africa from George Soros's Open Society Foundations and suggested this represented a significant leverage point. The comment could be seen as a suggestion Labour Together bring pressure to bear on the Open Society Foundations to withdraw funding for Holden's work. Neither of the consultancy's reports made any claim that Holden's journalism was inaccurate. The National understands the consultancy also explored Holden's domestic circumstances and family connections. So an attempt to essentially withdraw funding, potentially bankrupt a journalist on the basis of their journalism, of which the report had zero criticism, except that it was not politically in line with its commissioners. But APCO had another figure in their sights too. Andrew Feinstein, the independent candidate who stood in Keir Starmer's constituency in 2024, significantly reducing the Prime Minister's majority in his Holborn and St Pancras constituency. He was included as a target in the second report seen by The National. And The National reported this in September. The report identified Feinstein as being active in the Stop Starmer campaign group. News that Feinstein was considering running against Starmer emerged publicly for the first time on February 11, 2024. Feinstein gained 19% of the vote in the July election. Neither report revealed any wrongdoing by either Holden or Feinstein. Instead, they focused on their involvement in a variety of left-wing causes, which the second report suggested might indicate potential biases in their research and journalism. One of the reports also seemed keen to draw a link between the two journalists and Russia. The second report focused particularly on the possibility that Holden and Feinstein had Russian links. This was based partly on the fact both have backgrounds in South Africa, where Feinstein was an MP for the African National Congress, or ANC, between 1994 and 2001. The consultancy speculated they were linked to the Russians through ANC intelligence operations. Holden described the suggestion of Russian links as absurd. Andrieu and I have previously faced legal and extra-legal threats related to our investigations into Russian oligarchs linked to Putin, he said. Anybody who knows anything about South African politics knows that President Jacob Zuma was closely allied with Putin, and that Andrieu and I have been trying to get Zuma prosecuted for corruption for over a decade. Feinstein points out, I was the prosecution's lead witness in Zuma's corruption trial and was forced out of parliament by the ANC-led government for my role in exposing my own party's corruption. The consultancy's investigators appeared not to have taken even a cursory glance at our published work, he said. Now, Paul Holden also had another pretty bizarre experience a little later, with the National reporting this. In January 2024, Holden began working with the Daily Telegraph on a new article that further challenged Labour Together's claim that its failure to declare funding was the result of an administrative error. It provided evidence, some from Freedom of Information requests, that the Electoral Commission had given McSweeney very clear guidance in 2017 that funds should be declared. On February 8th, 2024, before the article was published but after the Daily Telegraph had reached out to Labour Together for a response, Holden says he received a phone call from a journalist calling himself Max Young. Young claimed to be from Open Democracy, an independent media outlet focused on progressive causes. Young quizzed Holden about what further information he planned to publish on McSweeney. Suspicious, Holden terminated the call. He contacted Open Democracy and found Young did not work there. Holden reported the call to the police. Now, there's one other interesting feature of the National reporting, and that's that some Westminster journalists may have been sitting on this story for a little while. The paper reports this. Holden received an email from Pippa Crerar, the political editor of The Guardian. Crerar informed him The Guardian planned to run an article the next day revealing, quote, that the National Cybersecurity Centre is investigating whether information obtained from an Electoral Commission hack may have been used to target the Labour Party. The Electoral Commission had reported it had been hacked in August 2023. She went on, The Guardian understands that part of the NCSC's investigation is whether emails subsequently leaked to you came from that cyber hack, Crear's email went on. In a subsequent email, she made clear the inquiry had been prompted by Labour Together reporting its concern to the NCSC. Holden firmly denied the allegation against him and threatened to sue, pointing out any suggestion that I received documents emanating from this apparently criminal hack of the Electoral Commission will be extremely damaging to my professional reputation. It is understood similar insinuations were made by Labour Together to the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph made its own inquiries with the NSCS and concluded it was safe to publish its article with Holden, which ran on February 28, 2024. The Guardian never ran its piece. Now, that whole article, that was some truly excellent and very timely reporting published by The National. But very oddly, it was hardly picked up by anyone when it came out in September last year. Earlier today, I spoke with Laura Webster, the editor of The National and the Sunday National, and I began by asking her how her paper had come to break this story.
So Richard Sanders and Peter Oborne came to me in September of last year with this story. They wanted to work with us because we had done a fair amount of work around Labour Together, Morgan McSweeney, and at the time, I think a lot of the media was still quite reluctant to go down that path. And you can speculate as to why maybe they didn't want to. Connections and everything like that might not have been so easy to get access if they said bad things about them. And we also were working on coverage of The Fraud, which was the book that Paul Holden was writing about the kind of dodgy behind the scenes goings on that led to Keir Starmer getting into power. So we revealed that both Paul and Andrieu Feinstein had been targeted and that Josh Simons had forwarded an email from the Sunday Times to this consultancy hired to investigate journalists. And thus we knew many months ago that Josh Simons knew well what was going on. We also revealed that investigators had dug into Paul Holden's private life and saw areas of leverage against him. And the fact that Labour Together tried to smear him and Andrieu in the national press. So there was quite a lot of detail in this article that does seem to have gone ignored by the national media.
So, Laura, one difference between your reporting back in September and the Times reporting now is that the Times reporting is focused on its own journalists, Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York, and they're not in your report at all. But another difference is that in the Times, or what I thought was a difference, is that in the Times report, they focus on the idea that this APCO report, or a version of it, was passed on by somebody to GCHQ. And then the fact that it had been passed on to GCHQ, or that GCHQ was looking at it, was used by Labour Together to, or other people, to smear the journalists involved. And I thought, oh, well, maybe that's the major difference between the Times reporting and your reporting back from September. Maybe that's a new information. But in fact, it's not new, because it's all in your reporting in September.
It is in our story as well. I think that it's quite simple as to why it wasn't picked up in the national press. You know, the fact that these key details weren't enough to trigger like a cabinet office investigation like it has been now, or this kind of mass outrage that we're seeing. It's because it's by a Scottish newspaper, a pro-independence newspaper, and it's a story that's focused on independent journalists. And the fact is that our story didn't involve Westminster lobby journalists, really. And so that's why it's a different story. This kind of snobbery that exists within the Westminster hack sphere is just pretty rotten. And it's so clear that they see themselves as above independent journalists. They have a really outdated idea of what real journalism is, what credible journalism is. And I think that is the simple reason why this wasn't picked up 6 months ago and made into the bigger story that it absolutely deserves to be.
So it also looks like there could be something to do with timing here, and I mean political timing. Because it does look like some of those Westminster lobby journalists may have had knowledge of this story earlier than they're perhaps letting on. So, for example, in your piece, you report that Pippa Crerar of The Guardian reached out to Paul Holden to ask for comment on the GCHQ part of this story.
Yes, and we contacted Pippa at the time for comment. I don't believe that she responded to the request for comment actually at the time. But things like this are exactly why people are abandoning the legacy establishment media and going towards independent media sources, which is the ironic thing.
Just on that point of timing again, I mean, I think it's really interesting that this story is coming out now when the Starmer government is looking at its most vulnerable. So, you know, The Guardian, for example, first ran this story about 8 days ago, I think, or a version of it, and then The Times did it spread over the weekend, you know, like all doing it at a time when things are a bit risky for Keir Starmer, whereas you guys reported it back in September when, you know, it was a story, not when it might be useful for creating political drama or creating the political downfall of a government. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it happens all the time. And maybe it makes me sound super cynical. Maybe they just came across it now, which is weird because as journalists, you think that they would have access to as much information as they can get access to, particularly a story that's already been published 6 months ago. It happens all the time. You have to look at the story like Peter Mandelson, how many people knew about what was going on with Peter Mandelson, how many journalists knew and didn't say anything. And as soon as it became a big story and it was possible to pile pressure upon people and push for people's resignations, suddenly everyone's got access to things that they didn't have before. And suddenly everybody wants to speak up and it helps them protect their own reputations. And it also gives them a great line when they can say, we managed to kind of get this scalp, as it were. Yeah, it's pretty yucky. It's not a nice element of the media at all. And it's another way that Westminster serves to protect the interests of the powerful. They only ever want to take someone down when it's suitable for them.
Now, one of the impacts of the Times reporting this weekend is that we've seen, you know, and quite rightly, an outpouring of support and horror on behalf of Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York. But we didn't see any of that at the time that you published your story in September when it was Paul Holden and Andrew Feinstein who were the targets. What was the impact of this Labour Together investigation and this sort of smear campaign on them?
Well, I would have liked to have seen more solidarity with them at the time. You know, we made it our front page story because we thought that it was terrible. And I have to say, I really feel for the Sunday Times journalists affected now. But what's happened to them is no worse than what happened to Andrew or Paul or anybody else who's been affected by what Labour Together were up to. And think the people who suddenly are very shocked should probably get their heads out of the sand, because this stuff has been going on for much longer than they feign knowledge of.
Now, Laura, there's another strange piece in your article, which is where Paul Holden gets a call from someone calling themselves Owen Young, who claims to work for Open Democracy. What happened there?
Well, I suppose we only know as much as is in the article, really. But it's another example of this kind of gangster behaviour that seems to have been going on at the think tank that helped get Keir Starmer to become Prime Minister. It's quite worrying, really. Should we have the people running the country acting like the mafia when they came to power, suggesting that they were offering change from the Conservatives? It doesn't really sound like change to me.
So what do you think the political fallout of all of this is going to be, of these new revelations? Or maybe not new revelations, because you reported them a while ago, but these revelations that now involve mainstream Westminster lobby journalists?
Well, I would hate to suggest that Westminster is a corrupt place when they wouldn't actually properly investigate the allies who carried out these investigations, or at least gave the green light for them to go ahead. I'm a pro-independence journalist. I don't believe that Westminster is going to be something that gets justice for people or helps to create change. The sort of London journalism sphere is in a terrible place, maybe some of the worst it's ever been. Westminster itself is a cesspit that's completely beyond reform. So I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, I'm sure Josh Simons and whoever else was involved is going to be held to account properly, because I simply don't believe that will happen. And it goes against my values and why I'm the editor of a pro-independence Scottish newspaper. I don't think that's possible.
And what do you think about Keir Starmer's comments today that he knew absolutely nothing about any of this?
It makes me think of In Succession when Brian Cox says that his favourite employees were the ones who ate the shit for him and he never knew anything about it. I do wonder if something like that went on, where, those actually carrying out the investigations or giving the green light for the investigations to go ahead were keeping it from Starmer. I don't know. I wasn't there, but it doesn't exactly suggest a healthy working environment if you think that's something that your boss might appreciate or your ally might appreciate. If that was me and I found out that people were carrying out private investigations into people who were seen as a threat towards me, I would be horrified. That's not the kind of thing that should be going on in modern society. It's horrible, obviously. So it doesn't really matter, I don't think, if he knew it was going on. I think it demonstrates the kind of company he keeps, and that tells us quite a lot.
One of the things we've seen here is that your great reporting, incredible investigation, was ignored, didn't break through. We find that at Novara Media as well, that our reporting and our investigations, breaking stories and so on, don't break through that bubble either. So how do you think independent media should tackle this? Should we be trying to break through? Should we not be trying to break through? What do you think the best approach is for us to have the impact that we actually deserve to have?
I think we all just have to keep going. There's so much great work being done and so many great journalists doing fantastic stuff with minimal resources compared to like Fleet Street. I think it gets harder and harder in a world where invisible algorithms controlled by billionaires decide who gets to see what. That makes it really challenging. You've got AI coming in and changing everything. Google has always been a huge way for us to connect with new readers, but as Google puts more and more AI overviews in, that gets more difficult. So we're up against it, not just in the kind of Westminster politics. It's a much bigger situation than that. But there's strength in numbers. People should support independent media. People should support progressive media. We can't do the work without the support of people. We can't give away all our work for free, like The Sun or whatever. It costs to produce quality journalism. And so if it's something that you're passionate about, support Novara, support The National, support whoever else is out there whose work you admire and you think is helping to change the country.
That was Laura Webster, editor of The National. I made one error in my questions. I'm sorry. I referred to the strange phone caller to Paul Holden as Owen Young. It was in fact Max Young. Sorry to any Owen Youngs out there. And as Laura said there, independent journalism is, it's super expensive and it needs your support. And The National does some great work, so well worth looking into them. In fact, there were some compliments in the chat. Stephen Calder said, I get The National's newspaper every day. I'm in Scotland, but I'd recommend it to anyone in the UK. It covers stories and issues the rest of the UK media don't, except maybe the Morning Star. And Maple Tea says The National is a really good source of information, to be fair.
I didn't know anything about this investigation, and it absolutely needs to be looked into, so the Cabinet Office will be establishing the facts.
Mr. Speaker, Matthew Doyle did not give a full account of his actions. And on Monday, I promised my party and my country there would be change. What was not known was the sheer depth and extent of the relationship. He lied about that to everyone for years.
That was Prime Minister Keir Starmer speaking 3 times in the last couple of weeks, each involving scandal revolving around senior figures close to the Prime Minister. The first was about Josh Simons, the former CEO of the Starmer-aligned Labour Together think tank, now under investigation for his alleged role in a smear campaign against British journalists. The second involves Matthew Doyle, Starmer's former head of communications, who was elevated to the House of Lords last year. He's now been stripped of the Labour whip over his alleged links to a convicted paedophile. And the final clip was, of course, about Peter Mandelson, appointed ambassador to the USA by Starmer last year, despite his well-known links to child rapist Jeffrey Epstein, and amid allegations that he fed confidential government information to the billionaire during the Brown government. And those are still allegations and they're under investigation. But Kieran, if there's one thing that we've learned in the last couple of weeks, isn't it that Keir Starmer just doesn't seem to know very much?
Know nothing, Prime Minister. Keep following that line down. I'm sure he will.
Nothing, do nothing.
Know nothing, do nothing. Exactly. Admit nothing. Yeah, I mean, it's just more of the same, isn't it? And I think just to circle back to what our brilliant interviewee was saying, one of the things she said was about Westminster being a cesspit. I think Keir Starmer isn't. There are things that are very unique about Keir Starmer, obviously, and I've tried to allude to some of them or outline some of them earlier. But he's not an aberration. He's not a total exception. He's a particularly obscene example of several terrible things about politics. But he's not in himself an aberration, and he comes out of a context. That context is, I agree with her, the cesspit of Westminster, as well as wider dynamics in society as well, to which Westminster is susceptible, the capture by big business and so on. But also, another thing that she points to, which is really important in all of this, is the relationship between mainstream media or legacy media and Keir Starmer's government, previous governments as well, the kind of courtier press, where there's a kind of paradox right at the heart of it, in the sense that they're supposed to be getting information accurately and reporting it fairly and factually, but they need to get access to those politicians, or at least they feel they need to get access to get the inside track, to get the best possible story, to beat their competitors. That then creates an incentive, or an imperative, you might say, to cozy up to them. And, many people will know this. I'm not privy to really exceptional information, but I know firsthand that lots of people have published stories about unfavourable stories about the government of the day over the past 10, 15 years, and have basically been told to F off, that they'll never have the kind of access they had before. That creates compliance. It manufactures a sort of pro-government hegemony, and it's part of that cesspit picture that she was talking about, which is much more complex than all of that, but that's part of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about something systematic there, but I cannot remember a time in recent history where a prime minister had to stand up 3 times in 2 weeks and say, I honestly, I didn't know anything about it. I mean, maybe he didn't know anything about it, but that means there's a lot going on under his nose that he doesn't know anything about.
Yeah, and look, there are so many things about Keir Starmer that we could tie into this that are relevant, right? Number one, that, as you say. But again, I think it's that Keir Starmer is kind of, every facet of him is rubbish. Rubbish or corrupt or bad. You have corrupt people who believe in something I mean, it's not comfortable. I don't feel comfortable saying that, but they do. And they actually do deliver for some people. But they are corrupt or a bit too comfortable with corruption. You have people who are corrupt who believe in things, or maybe they don't, but they're likable. They're charismatic. Again, I'm not saying that's a great thing or a virtue or something we should be. Keir Starmer is just several facets of rubbish or nonsense. I mean, there is nothing, across none of those indicators does he have qualities. And so I think you're right. You're not just projecting because there's an absence of those other qualities. It is quite remarkable, but he might be able to point to something if he had anything else, and he just doesn't.
On Friday, the High Court ruled that former Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's prescription of Palestine Action was unlawful on 2 grounds. First, Cooper didn't correctly follow her own policies in prescribing the group, considering the operational advantage of the prescription rather than just the actions of the group. And second, that the prescription interfered significantly with the public's right to free speech and assembly, an interference that couldn't be warranted by Palestine actions which the court found did not meet the threshold for prescription. Now, the ban on the group remains in place while the government prepares its arguments for an appeal. But on Sunday, Yvette Cooper finally spoke, appearing on the news rounds to give her version of events. This is with Trevor Phillips on Sky.
The High Court in London this week ruled that your decision to prescribe Palestine Action was disproportionate. What led you to take that decision other than the spray painting of some military aircraft? This was criminal damage, but it wasn't terrorism, was it?
Well, I followed the clear advice and recommendations, going through a serious process that the Home Office goes through, involving different agencies and police advice as well, which was very clear about the recommendation for prescription of this group. And the court has also concluded that this is not a normal protest group, that it has found that this group has committed acts of terrorism, that this group is not simply in line with democratic values and has promoted violence.
Forgive me.
The Home Secretary, let me just finish the point. The Home Secretary has appealed on the grounds on which the government lost. But look, in the end, the decision for a Home Secretary is what you always have to do, is take really seriously advice that you're given. And if you're given advice about potential risks of violence and risks to public safety, you have to take that advice very seriously.
I was given advice about risk to public safety, and I had to take that advice very, very seriously too. I took that advice, and I only took the advice, and I didn't do anything wrong myself because it was all advice. Yes, if you're a minister, you have to consider the advice. Nobody disagrees, but prescription and all the consequences for ordinary people's free speech that flows from it is a political act. It's not just, you're not an automaton as a minister who just has to follow the advice you're given. You have to think about it in the political context in which you're applying it or not applying it. And so it's your job to consider the political consequences of your decisions, the political consequences of taking the advice that you're now trying to blame for the decision you made. Kieran, does it seem like "it weren't me, Gov" is the only consistent messaging the Labour Party now has? We've seen it with Keir Starmer, and now we're seeing it again with Yvette Cooper.
Yeah, I mean, their sloganeering started with change, and it's descended into this. You're right, it is. It's know-nothingness. That seems to be the guiding principle of this government now, as it, 19 months into one of the largest majorities in British political history, totally fades into parody, farce, absurdity, disgrace. And the fish rots from the head, right? So it starts with Starmer saying, I knew nothing. Yvette Cooper is repeating that now. But the fundamentals are clear. The advice most likely was not as they say it was. That's the first thing. And I think that points to something more serious, which is that this was totally politically motivated. It's extremely clear, I think, or increasingly clear to people, I always suspect many of us did, that the government basically broke the law to please the Israel lobby and the arms manufacturing lobby.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, I was just thinking about, I find myself so angry because I think about obviously, as you know, I've met a lot of people who were arrested during, sign holding protests, who Cooper seemed, on the basis of this decision, quite happy to allow their careers, their futures, their reputations to be totally tarnished by a conviction under the Terror Act. Thousands of them. And there's this thing about this government which I think happens repeatedly, which is that they make decisions without any care for the consequences for ordinary people that they have. They're only interested in what it does for the polling. So, you had the end of the winter fuel allowance, you had the retention of the two-child benefit cap, you had the attempt to cut welfare, you had the prescription of Palestine Action, which had consequences even for those of us who didn't break the law, right? Or has consequences for those of us who didn't break the law, because it means that, our ability to do things is curtailed. And in fact, the chilling effect of that on normal protests that we might want to make or legal protests that we might want to make is also a very real thing. I just think, that for me is what epitomizes the government, a total lack of care for the people that their decisions affect or impact, and only an interest in what the newspapers are going to say or what's going to happen with the polls. Same with Peter Mandelson, like abused girls. Who cares? Let's send him to Washington.
Yeah.
Not by Peter Mandelson, incidentally. Peter Mandelson is not accused of anything like that, but by someone he described as his best pal, Jeffrey Epstein.
I mean, we have to remember that, though Gaza's not on our screens at the moment, this is a government that basically went beyond complicity in the worst genocide of the 21st century and partnered in it effectively. Partnered in it, profited from it, made political hay from it. And that obviously extends to the kind of activist reverberations of the genocide around the world, including the hunger strikers in this country. So I don't think, unfortunately, and I really try not to be a weathered old cynic, I really do, but there is no conclusion to draw other than that this government has a total disregard for human life of Palestinians and, indeed, a total disregard for human life of its own citizens. I've met one of the hunger strikers, and the consequences of all of this on them will last for their entire lifetime, regardless of what happens with their trial. And yet, it's already been deemed unlawful, Palestine Action being proscribed as a terror organisation, and as I say, clearly this was done for narrow political, short-term reasons and benefits. That will go. The physical and mental and psychological scars that this period of time in prison or persecution from the state will last these people a lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's what makes me so angry about the kind of her argument of, I just took advice, and Starmer's argument, which is the same. And you said there, the fish rots from the head, right? And it's the brass neck of Cooper making the exact same argument. And I guess, if the fish does rot from the head, then the brass neck comes next. The advice that Cooper could prescribe, not had to, just could, was not really very compelling anyway, and based on 3 out of nearly 400 Palestine actions, a point that the High Court picked up. That's less than 1% of the group's activities. That interview went on.
I'm not inviting criticism of you, but clearly the advice that you were given by the police, by the intelligence services, didn't stack up for, if you like, what the courts call the reasonable person, and certainly the judges in this case. Do you think that there's something that we need to look at in the way that the kind of advice that you and other Home Secretaries get?
Well, the current Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has looked again at this and looked at both the judgment of the court and also the advice that she is being given. And she's been clear that she disagrees with this decision, and that is why the Home Office is appealing. So, look, this is going to go to appeal, so that will mean that there will be another chance for the legal system to consider this. But I would just say, when you're faced with advice around public safety threats, it's really important to take those seriously. And I think you and everybody else would expect Home Secretaries to take very seriously the advice about public safety, the advice about threats to be taken very seriously.
It is completely unclear and unknown what advice about threats to the public she's referring to to there. What those threats even are, and it's not the first time Yvette Cooper has done this, where she's resorted to vague gestures of imminent danger and secret knowledge, rather than simply taking responsibility for a mistake or stating straightforward facts, saying this is the threat, this is what could happen. None of that said. It's always this kind of, oh, there were these, threats to the public. It's really unbecoming, actually, I think, for a minister of state to be so vague and suggestive when clearly if those threats had been any part of the intelligence she'd had, the court is very unlikely to have ruled the way that it did, I would have thought. Thank God things were a little less frustrating and much more entertaining over on the BBC, where Laura Kunsberg pulled a little stunt.
The High Court said that your decision to prescribe Palestine Action, essentially say they're a terrorist group, the court found that that was wrong, that you'd have made a mistake in how you went about that. One of those who's been arrested, 83-year-old Church of England priest Sue Parfitt, she's been charged under the Terrorism Act for holding a placard up supporting Palestine Action. We spoke to her yesterday and she has a message for you.
I do not consider myself a terrorist. It is quite ludicrous to consider that I am. I'm an Anglican priest and I have worked for peace and justice all my life. This is not what terrorism is. We know what terrorism is. It is people like Al-Qaeda and people who have done terrible acts against communities.
You got this wrong, didn't you?
Well, the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, has looked at this and been very clear. She disagrees with the judgment and is appealing against it.
That was the legend Sue Parfitt there. Spitting facts, basically. Cooper referred to Shabana Mahmood, the current Home Secretary, deciding that asking to appeal this decision. But look, if I were her, I think I'd be seriously calculating the costs of carrying the can for Yvette Cooper any further, especially as the media seems finally to have turned against the whole idea of banning Palestine Action. On Friday, The Guardian ditched a more tepid editorial line to declare the court ruling a humiliating blow for ministers. The Times has called the ban on Palestine Action excessive and has urged ministers to move on. And even The Telegraph called the prescription a clumsy response, saying it looked ridiculous. Telegraph getting things right for once. Kieran, what do you think is going to happen next? What should happen next?
Well, what can you even say after Sue Parfitt? There isn't much more. All roads go cold. But I would say, in terms of what happens next, look, in the long term, I think that in 100 years or 200 years, this will genuinely, I believe this will be regarded as one of the worst pieces of legislation ever passed in the 1,000-year history of the Houses of Parliament. I really, truly believe that. And we said it countless times on this show that not long ago that the Palestine Action hunger strikers will be regarded one day as we regard the suffragettes today. I didn't expect it to happen quite so quickly. I'm not saying that that's how they're regarded yet by a mainstream of public opinion, but it's, things are moving very quickly because it was such a disastrous, self-defeating, pathetic, snivelling attempt by the government to wedge through legislation that they thought would please the Israel lobby and the arms manufacturers and gain them political capital. It's obviously done the perfect opposite of that. What happens next is, look, I don't think people in politics or whatever commentary should make too many predictions about the future, but I do think that this, if it goes to the Supreme Court, the government will be defeated. And I don't know, I strongly hope that all of the hunger strikers and all of the Bryce Norton and all of the Filton 24 will be completely acquitted. I don't know if that will be the case, but I suspect things are turning in their, and by extension, our favour.
One of the great shocking things about the prescription when it happened, I mean, I couldn't really believe it was going to happen, until it did, because it's so draconian, right? And, just days before, I believe, there was a sort of memorial for the suffragettes and there was Yvette Cooper, like posing for a picture. And the prescription, and I don't think she understood this, or maybe she did understand it and she didn't give a shit, but the prescription essentially then sets a precedent, if it was allowed to stand, that the suffragettes would be prescribed, right? The suffragettes under Yvette Cooper's regime would not be allowed to continue with their work of bringing gender justice, gender equality into society in the UK. So it was, for me, it was like the precedent that was uncaringly being set by the Home Secretary being allowed to now prescribe groups for property damage, which is what the judgment says she did. She prescribed them on the basis of property damage, but also because prescribing them would be a tool of shutting them down, which was something she was not supposed to consider. Cynical stuff.
Yeah, that's how liberalism works. Time vindicates all, and the suffragettes, who actually killed people, by the way, and blew up a chancellor's house, they are now liberal poster people, and you know, I'm glad that they're celebrated, but you're absolutely right. It's a sign of how things become easier in retrospect. One day everyone will have been against this.
Francesca Albanese is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory. Since her appointment in May 2022, she's become something of an icon of the pro-Palestine movement. But her fierce, unapologetic advocacy for Palestinian human rights and criticism of Israel's genocide in Gaza has inevitably drawn the ire of Israel and its many powerful global outriders. Now, government ministers in Austria, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, and Italy are calling for her resignation, accusing her of anti-Semitism, not for the first time. It comes after comments she made at the Al Jazeera forum last week.
Instead of stopping Israel, most of the world has armed, giving it political excuses, political sheltering, economic and financial support. We now see that we as a humanity have a common enemy.
Now, look, I can see why some people might have something to object to there, but I do think there is also something about Israel's attack on Gaza which is diminishing of all of our humanity. I would be happy to say that. A country committing genocide is whatever its ethnic or religious makeup, a common enemy of humanity, not all people or anything, but just of humanity as a notion by definition. But look, wait. Those of you watching this rather than listening, you may have noticed that very clunky cut towards the end of the clip. Now, that wasn't your eyes deceiving you. It's because UN Watch, the group that put the video out, did indeed heavily doctor it. Here's an unedited video of her comments. It will repeat some of what you heard in the last clip, of course, but we think it's important for context.
The fact that instead of stopping Israel, most of the world has armed, giving it political excuses, political sheltering, economic and financial support. This is a challenge. The fact that most of the media in the Western world has been amplifying the pro-apartheid, the genocidal narrative is a challenge. And at the same time, here also lays the opportunity. Because if international law has been stabbed in the heart, it's also true that never before the global community has seen the challenges that we all face. We who do not control large amounts of financial capitals, algorithms, and weapons. We now see that we as a humanity have a common enemy.
So obviously, the common enemy of humanity Albanese is referring to isn't Israel per se, but those who, quote, control large amounts of financial capital, algorithms, and weapons. That is obviously true. And unless you are yourself an anti-Semite who thinks only Jews control financial capital, algorithms, and weapons, it's impossible to read Albanese's comments as other than a critique of an international system that ties profit to violence. Israel and its Western allies quite clearly sit at the heart of that. Now, UN Watch, the group behind the doctored video, has a long history of accusing the UN of anti-Israel bias. But what's truly extraordinary is that ministers from 5 European countries saw fit to publicly call for Albanese's resignation on grounds of anti-Semitism without even checking the source material. We really do have idiots in charge. Amnesty International hit back at the ministers, saying this in a statement. It's reprehensible that ministers in Australia, Czechia, France, Germany and Italy have attacked the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory, Francesca Albanese, based on a deliberately truncated video to misrepresent and gravely misconstrue her messages, as is clear from watching her original address in its entirety. The ministers that have spread disinformation must act beyond merely deleting their comments on social media, as some have done. They must publicly apologise and retract any calls for Francesca Albanese's resignation. Their governments must also investigate how this disinformation happened with a view to preventing such situations. Amnesty International and Albanese herself responded to the smear on French television channel France 24.
I challenge everyone to find what I'm accused of saying, that Israel is the enemy of the humanity. I've never said that. I've said something very different, but of course it's been manipulated so as to corroborate the defamation against me. What I've said is very different, and I was in a panel not with Hamas leaders. This is yet again another distortion. I was invited by Al Jazeera to speak at a panel composed of jurists, including former prosecutors of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, and I was honored to be among them, frankly. And what I said was, of course, commenting on the genocide and blaming not just Israel, but the system. It's the system that has armed the genocide, that has sheltered genocide from accountability, and has also profited from the genocide. It's this system that concerns much beyond, a reality much beyond Israel, as I've often said, that is the enemy, that is our common enemy.
Last question.
Maybe it's too complicated. It's too sophisticated for the simplistic minds of those who crush everything into anti-Semitism in order to shelter Israel from accountability.
Here's a little tip for whoever edited that video, whoever from UN Watch is responsible for that. Donald Trump is trying to get $1 billion from the BBC for less. Maybe look into it, Francesca. Despite evidence to the contrary, as well as Albanese and Amnesty's protestations, France and Germany have doubled down in their calls for her resignation. This is a report on the French government's reasons for sticking to its guns.
Now, I just want to add here that despite Francesca Albanese clarifying her position, as we heard to us, the French Foreign Ministry is standing by its position that she must resign. The French Foreign Minister said her comments add to what he called a long list of scandalous positions. He accused her of justifying the attacks of 7th October in Israel, and he accused her of comparing Israel to the Third Reich. So France is standing by that position of her to resign. And Germany, just today, Thursday, has also joined France in that stance, also calling for her removal as UN Special Rapporteur.
It's interesting that so many of those accusations there are ones that are pushed by UN Watch as well. I mean, I haven't looked into them all. I can't say for sure which are true, which aren't, but I do know that those belong to a list which is published on UN Watch's website. Kieran, what do you make of this? I mean, I said we really are led by idiots in that piece. Is it just that they're idiots, or is there something more to it?
Idiots and living in a repetitive simulation. It's old wine in new bottles, Stephen. It's old wine in new bottles. If someone, the past 10 years have shown us anything, it's, well, several things, but one of them is if someone is a good communicator on Palestine and has some degree of power in relation to the question of Palestine, it is practically an iron law that sooner or later they will be accused of anti-Semitism. And a few weeks ago, we were talking about Andrew Marr. We were talking about Andrew Marr in respect to Epstein and saying that despite all of the evidence, completely disregarding the possibility that he's an asset of Israel and saying it's Russia. And I said on this show that he is incapable of doing his job. With Albanese, it's the perfect opposite of that. She is incapable of not doing her job. And for that, of course, she must be punished. It's extremely difficult. That's why I have so much respect for her. Among many other things, it's so difficult to work within the establishment, but not for the establishment. It's such a difficult thing to do. I mean, look at her title, right? UN Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian Occupied Territories. A bit of a mouthful. Of course, occupied territories includes Gaza. Imagine what a colossal waste of time and money Francesca Albanese would be if she didn't say and do what she's doing. I have enormous respect for her. But really, ultimately, in a perfect world, she would just be doing her job. Her job is to argue for, advocate for, and record abuses of or the upholding of Palestinian human rights in the West Bank and in Gaza. That's her job. And she does it incredibly well, simply because she works within the establishment, but not for the establishment. And again, as I say, she must be destroyed for that. Final thing I'll say about her is that what a contrast with our own human rights lawyer, Prime Minister. She's a human rights lawyer by training. But unlike Keir Starmer, she is clearly somebody who believes in what she trained in. And again, for that, she must be punished.
Yeah. I was thinking, actually, as you were speaking about Wes Streeting's revelations of his text messages with Peter Mandelson. And, there he is saying to Peter Mandelson during a time at which the government was quite resistant to disciplining Israel in any sort of way, that Israel was obviously committing war crimes in front of our eyes. And you sort of think about these people now trying to have Francesca Albanese sacked. No doubt, they also know that Israel was committing war crimes in front of our eyes. And yet it's, a doctored video of Francesca Albanese that causes more heat than, those repeated breaches of international law. I will give one little anecdote about Francesca Albanese just very quickly from this weekend. Our audience may know, you may know, there is someone who watches the show and appears in the chat called Mags. I met her a few times at Palestine Action protests where she was a sign holder, and she's been arrested a few times there doing it as well. And over the weekend, she posted a little carousel of her arrests, and she got a huge amount of flack. Loads of trolls sort of dived on to call her all kinds of things, and it was pretty disgusting. And then suddenly, Francesca Albanese appeared with a comment to say, "Well done, good for you."
Well, that's a really beautiful story. Can I just say something which echoes that or corroborates it, I guess? Francesca Albanese happened to be in Sidi Bou Said, the port in Tunis, the night that my boat was bombed by Israel on the flotilla. And we rushed down, it was about midnight, we rushed down to the port. And it was complete pandemonium. The police had no grip on the situation. We didn't know what had just happened. We didn't know if we were going to be bombed again. I mean, genuinely, everybody was, and it was the middle of the night. And Francesca Albanese was right down there in the middle of it all, chain smoking and trying to get to the bottom of what was going on. I shouldn't let myself stray in this direction because we're an analysis show, but she's an icon.
I think it's a good analysis to say that chain smokers are often icons, frankly. All right, Stephen, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Kieran, what a pleasure.
Sorry to confuse you all. No, really, thank you, Kieran, for joining me tonight. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Please come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.